In the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean during the height of the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a strategic and psychological dilemma that would haunt its admirals for the remainder of the conflict. From the earliest stages of the war in 1942, intelligence reports filtered through the meticulous channels of Japanese command suggested a pattern in the movements of the United States Navy's carrier task forces, particularly those centered around the Essex-Class carriers, the backbone of the American naval offensive. These floating fortresses of steel and aviation prowess, each bristling with a complement of over 90 aircraft and supported by layers of anti-aircraft guns, radar systems, and a highly trained crew, began to appear in the Western Pacific with a regularity that confounded Japanese reconnaissance and espionage. Every 6 weeks, without fail, intelligence officers and aerial observers would note the sudden arrival of one or more Essex-class carriers in regions that were deemed strategically critical, such as the waters near the Solomon Islands, the Central Pacific archipelagos, and ultimately approaching the Mariana Islands. These appearances were not merely coincidental or random, they represented a meticulously calculated pattern of American naval logistics and operational planning, reflecting the United States Navy's growing mastery over carrier-based warfare and long-range power projection. Japanese admirals, steeped in decades of maritime tradition and naval doctrine, found themselves increasingly at a loss to explain how these massive carriers could appear so predictably and yet so elusively, as if some unseen hand guided their movements across thousands of nautical miles of hostile ocean. The perplexity was compounded by the stark realization that while Japanese intelligence could detect surface movements, it often failed to anticipate the intricate choreography of carrier task forces, including the rapid deployment of aircraft, the establishment of forward operating bases, and the seamless coordination with submarines and supporting cruisers. This cognitive dissonance, knowing that enemy forces were constantly on the move yet being unable to comprehend the mechanics behind such precise operational timing, placed an enormous psychological strain on the high command, forcing admirals to question the reliability of their reconnaissance, the effectiveness of their communication networks, and the very assumptions upon which their naval strategies had been built. Meanwhile, American commanders, operating with the confidence born of superior industrial capacity and the cumulative lessons of early Pacific engagements, exploited this predictable cycle to maintain unbroken pressure on Japanese defensive positions, conducting raids, establishing air superiority, and reinforcing isolated garrisons with an efficiency that Japanese planners could scarcely fathom. The Essex-class carriers, with their immense air wings, were not simply ships. They were mobile airbases capable of projecting overwhelming force hundreds of miles inland, a capability that fundamentally altered the calculus of naval engagements. Japanese admirals, who had long relied on the doctrine of decisive surface battles and the judicious use of capital ships, found themselves grappling with a new reality, the dominant role of air power in determining the outcome of naval confrontations, and the unsettling truth that even the most heavily fortified islands and harbors could be rendered vulnerable by the repeated and systematic arrival of American carrier forces. The recurring 6-week cycle became a source of strategic anxiety, as intelligence officers scrambled to track movements, decipher schedules, and predict the next operational target, only to be consistently confounded by the Americans' ability to move quickly, strike decisively, and vanish before effective countermeasures could be deployed. The Japanese Navy's traditional reliance on battleship-centric tactics seemed increasingly obsolete in the face of this relentless, mobile aerial assault capability, and admirals were forced into a reactive posture, attempting to plug gaps and reinforce positions without ever truly understanding the pattern that dictated American strategy. In essence, the Essex carriers became both a tangible and symbolic representation of the United States' industrial and strategic supremacy, colossal steel leviathans whose presence appeared with unnerving regularity, yet whose inner workings, deployment schedules, and tactical intentions remained shrouded in secrecy. The psychological impact of this uncertainty cannot be overstated. Japanese commanders, often seasoned veterans of naval combat, were confronted not only with the material superiority of the enemy but with the intangible yet equally debilitating challenge of anticipating actions that seemed preordained yet entirely inscrutable. With each 6-week interval, the Japanese High Command experienced a mounting sense of inevitability, a recognition that the Americans' capacity to project power, sustain operations, and replenish losses at a pace far beyond Japan's own logistical abilities was inexorably tipping the balance of naval supremacy in the Pacific theater. Every intelligence report, every reconnaissance flight, and every intercepted signal served to reinforce the unsettling awareness that they were perpetually a step behind, witnessing an enemy whose operational tempo and organizational depth allowed it to strike at will, withdraw without engagement, and appear again with the same predictable regularity. A relentless cycle that underscored the growing futility of traditional defensive strategies and the dawning reality that the Essex-class carriers were not merely vessels of war but instruments of psychological dominance over the embattled Japanese Navy. As the war in the Pacific unfolded, the Essex-class carriers became the centerpiece of a strategic revolution that the Japanese Navy could neither anticipate nor adequately counter, a revolution that redefined the very nature of naval warfare. These carriers, products of meticulous American design, engineering, and mass production, were emblematic of the United States' unparalleled industrial might, capable of being constructed and deployed at a pace that outstripped Japanese shipbuilding capabilities. Each vessel carried not only a formidable complement of aircraft but also advanced radar systems, efficient command and control networks, and extensive logistical support that allowed for sustained operations far from home ports. Japanese intelligence, relying heavily on a combination of aerial reconnaissance, radio interception, and reports from submarines and scouts, found itself in a perpetual state of partial awareness. They could observe the presence of the carriers, often glimpsed in fleeting reconnaissance flights or through intercepted signals, yet the full scale of their operational capacity and the intricacies of their deployment cycles remained hidden. Every 6 weeks, as the American carriers appeared off the coastlines of contested islands or within striking distance of Japanese-held territories, the admirals were forced into a defensive posture, attempting to anticipate targets, mobilize fleets, and prepare air defenses, often only to discover that the carriers had already launched devastating sorties and moved on before Japanese countermeasures could be effectively implemented. This recurring pattern, visible yet enigmatic, created an operational paradox. The Japanese could observe the carriers, yet they could not engage them decisively, nor could they fully comprehend the strategic intent behind each deployment. The Essex-class carriers operated not as isolated ships but as the hub of complex task forces that included destroyers, cruisers, and support vessels, all coordinated with precision that maximized flexibility and minimized exposure to counterattack. For Japanese admirals, this coordination appeared almost preternatural, a demonstration of operational mastery that seemed to defy the inherent limitations of distance, communication, and resource allocation in the Pacific theater. The repeated appearance of these carriers every 6 weeks was not merely a matter of timing, it was a reflection of the American Navy's ability to sustain a tempo of operations that Japanese forces could neither match nor disrupt. From a psychological standpoint, the predictability of the cycle imposed a dual burden. On the one hand, it offered a narrow window for planning defensive measures, yet on the other hand, it amplified the frustration of knowing that any action taken was likely to be insufficient, delayed, or rendered moot by the carrier's superior mobility and air power. Intelligence officers, tasked with mapping movements, estimating aircraft availability, and predicting likely strikes, often found that their data, no matter how diligently collected, failed to translate into actionable insight, leaving admirals to rely increasingly on intuition, past experience, and the hope of exploiting minor errors in American planning. In the field, Japanese garrisons braced for the arrival of air raids, yet the carriers' ability to strike and withdraw rapidly meant that even well-prepared defenses were often bypassed or overwhelmed. The Essex-class carriers' air wings, composed of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, were meticulously rotated to maintain operational readiness, their pilots trained to execute coordinated attacks with precision and to exploit weaknesses in Japanese defensive formations. Each strike was a demonstration of the carrier's strategic significance. They could deliver concentrated firepower anywhere in the theater, threaten multiple islands simultaneously, and then vanish, leaving Japanese forces to reckon with the damage, casualties, and logistical disruptions inflicted in their wake. The cumulative effect of this relentless cycle was profound. It eroded confidence within the Japanese Navy, fostering a sense of inevitability that the Americans, with their inexhaustible resources and disciplined execution, would continue to dominate the Pacific, and that any attempt at preemptive action was likely to be thwarted by superior intelligence, maneuverability, and timing. Admirals and staff officers debated endlessly over how to disrupt the pattern, to anticipate strikes, and to conserve limited forces for decisive engagements, yet each discussion seemed to confirm the underlying reality: the Americans had transformed naval warfare, creating a system in which their carriers' appearances dictated the tempo of the conflict, and the Japanese were forever forced into a reactive, defensive stance. The Essex carriers were more than ships, they were the embodiment of operational inevitability, a moving axis around which the theater of war revolved, and each 6-week cycle became both a strategic anchor and a source of mounting anxiety for Japan's naval command. As the months progressed, the psychological toll of witnessing these recurring deployments, combined with the tangible losses inflicted by the carrier's air wings, began to shape Japanese planning in ways that were both subtle and profound, forcing a reconsideration of traditional doctrines, the reallocation of scarce resources, and an increasing reliance on fortifications and static defenses that were ill-suited to counter the dynamic mobility of the American carrier forces. The repetition of this cycle highlighted the fundamental asymmetry in the Pacific conflict, where the Japanese were constrained by limited industrial capacity, extended supply lines, and the vulnerabilities of dispersed island holdings. The Americans leveraged superior numbers, efficient logistics, and the strategic agility of carrier warfare to dictate the rhythm of combat. Every 6 weeks, the Essex-class carriers' appearances served as both a physical and symbolic demonstration of the United States' growing dominance, and Japanese admirals, despite their skill and experience, could only watch, analyze, and attempt to react, knowing that the carrier's operational tempo and strategic foresight would continue to shape the unfolding narrative of the Pacific War in ways they could neither fully anticipate nor control. The operational impact of the Essex-class carriers on Japanese strategic planning extended far beyond mere battlefield engagements. It penetrated every layer of naval doctrine, intelligence assessment, and command decision-making, reshaping the way Japanese admirals conceived the art of war in the Pacific. Unlike the earlier years of naval combat, when battleships, cruisers, and destroyers formed the backbone of maritime power, the recurring presence of these carriers demonstrated that control of the sea could no longer be measured simply in tonnage or gunnery. It was now inseparably linked to the projection of air power, the timing of attacks, and the coordination of complex task forces across vast distances. The American Navy, fully cognizant of its industrial and technological advantages, had meticulously orchestrated a cycle in which the Essex-class carriers would appear every 6 weeks at strategically significant locations, executing strikes, reconnaissance missions, and logistical support operations in a rhythm that Japanese intelligence struggled to decode. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this meant that no strategic planning could assume a period of respite. The carrier's predictable yet unfathomable cycle created a constant state of pressure, forcing admirals to maintain fleets in readiness, keep aircraft stationed in dispersed garrisons, and allocate fuel, ammunition, and supplies with painstaking precision, all while being acutely aware that the next American strike could arrive at any moment. The carrier's operations were underpinned by a sophisticated logistical network that ensured rapid replenishment of aircraft, ordnance, and crew support, allowing for sustained offensive capabilities that Japanese forces, with their more constrained industrial output and increasingly overstretched supply lines, could not hope to match. The psychological consequences of this operational superiority were profound. Japanese admirals, conditioned by years of conventional naval doctrine that emphasized decisive engagements and the calculated maneuvering of capital ships, found themselves grappling with an adversary whose strategic reach and operational tempo imposed a continuous, almost omnipresent threat. Intelligence officers reported sightings of carrier task forces, yet these reports rarely contained enough detail to facilitate effective preemptive strikes. The Americans maintained strict radio discipline, employed deceptive maneuvers, and leveraged the mobility of their fleets to appear where least expected, even as the 6-week schedule suggested a predictable rhythm. This duality, apparent predictability coupled with operational elusiveness, created a unique strategic paradox for Japanese command. They could anticipate the timing of the carrier's arrival yet remain unable to engage them decisively, a dynamic that eroded confidence and fostered a sense of strategic helplessness. The carrier's air wings, composed of highly trained pilots flying fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft, executed missions with exacting precision, delivering sustained pressure on Japanese-held islands, naval installations, and supply routes. Even heavily fortified positions could not withstand the combination of mobility, firepower, and coordination embodied in the Essex-class task forces. The recurring appearance of these carriers every 6 weeks also facilitated a learning curve for American commanders, allowing them to refine tactics, rotate squadrons, and coordinate multi-pronged assaults with increasing effectiveness, further compounding Japanese difficulties in mounting a coherent defense. Admirals and staff officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy recognized that traditional tactics, concentration of battleships, shore-based air patrols, and static island defenses, were increasingly inadequate, yet there were few viable alternatives. Japan's industrial limitations and the dispersed nature of its holdings meant that resources had to be spread thin, creating vulnerabilities that the Americans exploited repeatedly. The Essex-class carriers' impact was thus both material and psychological. They imposed losses in ships, aircraft, and personnel, while simultaneously undermining confidence in established doctrine, sapping morale, and forcing a reactive rather than proactive posture. Each cycle of appearance reinforced the perception of American dominance, embedding a sense of inevitability that no Japanese countermeasure could fully mitigate. The interplay between logistical superiority, operational tempo, and technological innovation exemplified by these carriers highlighted the evolving nature of modern naval warfare, emphasizing flexibility, projection of force, and sustained operational reach. Japanese admirals, observing from command centers and forward posts, understood that the 6-week cycle was not an arbitrary scheduling quirk but a deliberate manifestation of strategic foresight, operational discipline, and industrial capacity, all converging to create an unassailable advantage in the Pacific theater. The repeated, precise appearance of the Essex carriers forced a re-evaluation of fundamental assumptions. No longer could Japanese planners rely solely on surprise, traditional fleet engagements, or defensive fortifications. They had to contend with a foe whose mobility, coordination, and timing dictated the rhythm of war itself. This realization did not merely alter battle plans, it reshaped the entire strategic environment, compelling Japanese commanders to adopt defensive postures, anticipate attacks with incomplete intelligence, and grapple with the uncomfortable truth that the Americans, through a combination of technological innovation, logistical mastery, and disciplined execution, had redefined the rules of naval engagement, with the Essex-class carriers at the center of this transformative shift. The carriers' appearances every 6 weeks thus symbolized a broader strategic inevitability, a reminder that the Pacific War was being waged not only with steel and firepower but through meticulous orchestration, industrial superiority, and the relentless application of operational art, leaving Japanese admirals to watch, adapt, and endure, knowing that each cycle would bring further challenges, losses, and the undeniable march of American strategic dominance across the theater. By the latter stages of the Pacific conflict, the Essex-class carriers had become the embodiment of American naval innovation, operational mastery, and strategic inevitability, a force whose repeated appearances every 6 weeks dictated not only the tempo of combat but the broader contours of Japanese defensive planning, morale, and strategic thought. Japanese admirals, once confident in the primacy of their battleships, cruisers, and traditional naval doctrine, were confronted with the undeniable reality that the projection of air power from these mobile, steel leviathans had rendered conventional tactics increasingly obsolete. Each 6-week cycle served as both a reminder of the Americans' industrial capacity and a demonstration of their ability to integrate technology, logistics, and operational planning into a coherent and devastatingly effective instrument of war. The carrier's ability to appear predictably yet strike with unpredictable efficiency created a paradoxical dynamic. Japanese forces could anticipate the timing of the carrier's arrival but rarely the exact location, force composition, or nature of the ensuing assaults. The Essex-class carriers operated not in isolation but as the nucleus of sophisticated task forces that combined air, sea, and reconnaissance capabilities into a seamless operational machine, coordinated with precision that Japanese intelligence and reconnaissance found nearly impossible to counter. Reconnaissance flights, signal interception, and submarine patrols often yielded fragments of information, glimpses of a carrier group here, reports of aircraft movements there, but these pieces rarely coalesced into actionable insight, leaving admirals to rely on estimations, assumptions, and increasingly reactive strategies. In response, Japanese high command attempted to concentrate forces, strengthen coastal fortifications, and deploy aircraft in defensive patterns, yet these measures were continually undermined by the carriers' mobility, the skill of their aircrews, and the disciplined rotation of aircraft that ensured operational readiness even under sustained engagement. The psychological strain of this operational reality compounded material losses. Admirals and officers alike grappled with a creeping sense of inevitability, a recognition that the Americans' capacity to sustain offensive cycles, replenish losses, and coordinate large-scale operations exceeded Japan's ability to respond effectively. The 6-week pattern was not merely a tactical scheduling convenience, it was a manifestation of strategic foresight, industrial supremacy, and the cumulative lessons of prior engagements, allowing American commanders to maintain pressure on multiple fronts while simultaneously adapting to evolving conditions in the theater. Every deployment served as a learning opportunity, enabling refinements in carrier-based strike tactics, reconnaissance integration, and logistical coordination, all while keeping Japanese forces off balance and perpetually on the defensive. For the Japanese Navy, this meant a continuous struggle to defend widely dispersed island holdings, anticipate enemy movements with incomplete intelligence, and maintain operational cohesion despite losses in personnel, material, and morale. Admirals were forced into reactive postures, attempting to plug gaps in defenses, coordinate counterattacks, and forecast enemy intentions, often only to find that the Essex carriers had already executed their operations and withdrawn to areas beyond immediate reach, leaving destruction and disruption in their wake. The recurring appearances every 6 weeks highlighted the profound asymmetry in strategic capacity. The Americans possessed the industrial base, technological innovation, and operational flexibility to project sustained, overwhelming force, while Japan was constrained by limited production, extended supply lines, and a naval doctrine increasingly ill-suited to countering mobile carrier operations. Beyond the tangible losses of ships and aircraft, the Essex-class carriers inflicted a subtler yet equally consequential effect. They shaped Japanese strategic thinking, forcing a re-evaluation of doctrine, a reconsideration of risk, and an acknowledgement of the changing character of modern naval warfare. Commanders faced the dual challenge of preparing for imminent strikes while recognizing the futility of traditional approaches, with each 6-week cycle reinforcing the perception of American inevitability and operational mastery. The carrier's presence became a constant, unyielding metric against which Japanese defensive effectiveness was measured, a relentless reminder that time and again, the initiative lay with the Americans, whose ability to combine mobility, firepower, and foresight dictated the pace and outcome of engagements across the vast Pacific theater. As the war progressed, the Essex-class carriers not only reshaped battle outcomes but also redefined the psychological and strategic landscape of the conflict. Japanese admirals observed, analyzed, and adapted, yet they were consistently forced into a position of reaction rather than action, aware that the rhythm of the carrier's appearances, seemingly predictable yet operationally elusive, would continue to dictate the course of the Pacific War. Ultimately, the Essex-class carriers symbolized a transformation in naval warfare, illustrating that victory in the modern age relied not solely on the strength of guns and armor, but on the mastery of mobility, timing, and integrated operational capability, leaving the Japanese high command to confront the sobering reality that the Americans had created a force whose mere presence every 6 weeks could alter the strategic balance, erode defensive capability, and reshape the very rules of engagement, ensuring that the tide of war flowed inexorably in favor of those who had harnessed innovation, coordination, and industrial power to redefine what it meant to wage war across the oceans. The legacy of these repeated deployments endured long after individual engagements, a testament to the transformational impact of carrier-based operations, the psychological strain of facing an adversary capable of sustained dominance, and the enduring lesson that in the Pacific theater, as in all modern conflicts, mastery of operational rhythm, logistics, and mobility could determine the fate of empires and the lives of millions caught in the sweep of global war.